we're going to start talking about some non-probability samples. And these do not give you a generalizable result. It's important to know that the probability samples we just talked about, you can generalize to the entire population. Non-probability samples cannot be generalized. The first one is what we call a purposive sample. And this is where the researcher exercises discretion over who is observed. The researcher picks who we'll observe. You choose. The famous example of this is Richard Fenno, the patron saint of congressional research. If you take Congress classes, you will read some Fenno. Whether it's Professor Koopman or myself, you'll be reading Fenno, and it's really interesting stuff. His famous book is called Homestyle. And what he did was he followed members of Congress around. He went from one member of Congress, he had 6 or 7 of them he followed around, and just learned about how they act in their district versus how they act in D.C. He chose these members of Congress, in part because he thought they'd be interesting, and in part because he found people who would speak to him. This does not give us a generalizable answer to all members of Congress, but this is still one of the most important works ever written in Congress because it teaches us something, and it gives us ways to test more hypotheses. You can learn things by talking to people. You can learn things for why do my friends feel the way they do, or why did these people I chose feel the way they do. That might give you insights into a bigger study later, or an insight into the types of people you're speaking to. It's not necessarily bad, but you can't generalize to an entire population from there. The next type is what's called the convenience sample. And what this means is the researcher just samples whoever is around, who's ever convenient to speak to. The best example of this is going to be the interviewer for your local news station, just interviewing people on a street corner, whoever happens to walk by at that time. These are not necessarily good for scientific research. They're good for, I don't know what they're good for really other than just telling stories, but they can be good for that. The problem is there's all sorts of selection issues with who happens to be on that street corner at a certain time. If you stood outside, pick Monroe Hall at Mary Washington and surveyed people there about what do you think of Mary Washington, you would get, a couple hundred people pretty quickly. But you'd have mostly social science majors. You'd have history majors, geography majors, poli-sci majors, social majors, people like that. You wouldn't get a lot of business majors. You wouldn't get a lot of, hard science majors. It's a problem. It doesn't give you that randomness that you're looking for. It doesn't give everyone an equal probability of being sampled. You wouldn't have as many BLS majors. You wouldn't have any non-traditional students who maybe aren't on campus as much as the traditional students. You need to think about that sort of thing if you want to do a convenience sample. Probability sample is the way to go, unless you're just trying to get info for a news story or something like that. The next type is a quota sample, and this is like a stratified sample, except you're not randomly selecting people. And what this means is you're looking for, okay, I'm doing 100 people, I need 52 men, I need 48 women. So I go and try to find a bunch of women to speak to, and then I go and try to find a bunch of men, and I deliberately seek them out. That's a problem, because we're not good at random number generating. Humans are really bad at that. We have all sorts of biases. I might look for, more attractive people to speak to, or I might look for younger people to speak to because I'm older and they might listen to me more, younger people. Or I might choose older people because they're more interesting and have more opinions about politics or whatever. And I don't necessarily do these things on purpose. And that's the biggest part to be aware of, is that I don't do these things on purpose, I just do them. We are so unaware of many of our biases that it's impossible, unless you have a computer do the random selection for you, it's impossible to get it right. You will introduce some sort of bias into the system, even if you're not aware of it. I always think we're remarkably good at sensing things in people, even if we don't know it, and maybe they don't know it. Don't do a quota sample, do a stratified sample. Let the random number generator do the work. The final type here we're going to talk about is the snowball sample. And what this means is you ask people to refer others to be observed. You ask one person, they refer you 3 people. Each of those people refer you 3 people, 3 people, 3 people, 3 people. And it snowballs. The snowball gets bigger as it rolls downhill. This one is a non-probability sample. Obviously, there's no randomness involved here. You're getting networks of friends in a lot of cases. But this can actually be a very useful type of survey, especially in hard-to-find populations. One of the classic examples you'll see in research is if you're trying to survey drug users. Well, you can call people on the phone and say, hey, do you use intravenous drugs? And guess what? They're going to tell you no for the most part. But if you can find a couple people, go down to wherever people use drugs, ask them some questions, and then say, hey, will you refer 3 people? Do you know 3 other drug users? They'll probably know 3 other drug users. They'll send you to 3 people. And then you say, hey, your friend Bill told me to call you. He said you might be a drug user and I'm doing a survey. Will you help me out? It's really good for hard-to-find populations like that. 1, where people will lie, or 2, small populations. I always tell the story of my wife is Chinese. And when we moved to Spotsylvania, I looked up the census info, and there was 25 Chinese people, or Asian people, I guess, not even Chinese people, Asian people in Spotsylvania, where we live. 25 people. So if you're trying to find Chinese people in Spotsylvania, you could call everyone in Spotsylvania and hope you get lucky and eventually get all 25. Or you can do a couple different things. You could find a Chinese person and say, hey, do you know any other Asian people in Spotsy? And there's a better than average chance that they will. You could go to the Asian market down in, I'm not sure if it's in Fredericksburg or Spotsy. It's in kind of the border area out there. I think it's in Spotsy. You go to the 5 Mile International Market, and you could talk to the people there and ask them to refer people, and that will help you get your sample. People of a certain population, whether it's heroin drug users, or IV drug users, heroin users, or if it's Asian people in Spotsylvania, they're more likely to be able to refer you to other people in that population than you are just to get it by random chance. The snowball sample can actually be very useful, so it's something to think about.